there and welcome to the front page. Thank you for joining our 4th edition and our first since Frankie Dettori became a free agent. A week isn't only a long time in politics. Yes, we discussed Dettori and the Gosdens last week, but back then they were still a union, not any longer. A new word has entered the racing lexicon, sabbatical. But what does that mean for the sport's most famous face, his former employers and perhaps also a few others? It wasn't only Dettori who last week discovered his services were not required. Westover was superb in the Irish Derby, but Rob Hornby, who steered him into 3rd at Epsom, was passed over in favour of Colin Keane. The owners insisted it wasn't malicious, but will it turn out that Hornby's separation from Westover is permanent or just a sabbatical? And this week we're not talking merely about those who ride, but also those who watch. We're asking, is racing doing enough for its older fans, or are they turning into the sport's lost generation? Some of them feel shunned and are staying away. For racing, the question now is, as with Dettori, will they come back? My name is Lee Mottershead, and this week I'm joined by my esteemed Racing Post colleagues Maddy, Playle and Chris Cook as we talk about those big issues and then decide ultimately what should be our front page of the week. And I would say going into it that the odds-on favourite is the Dettori story, because he is Frankie Dettori. He's the most famous jockey in the world. As I said at the top of the programme, we did discuss this last week, but much has gone on since then. On Thursday, we discovered when the declarations came through for Newmarket's Criterion Stakes card that Frankie wasn't riding the 3 horses that John and Thady Gosden had declared, including 1 in a listed race, 1 in a Group 3. On Friday morning, John Gosden had spoken about how Frankie had been in Italy the week before Royal Ascot and the week after Royal Ascot. That was interestingly volunteered, that information. And he spoke about a summit meeting that will be taking place later that day. At the same time, Frankie's manager, Pete Burrell, was talking about how he and his client felt about the situation, how they didn't really know anything. Ultimately, it led to, on Friday evening, the statement coming through via Tom Goff, former Racing Post employee who's close to the Gosden yard, in which it was revealed that they were taking a sabbatical from each other, but they remained great friends. We heard from Frankie on Saturday at Newmarket, where he delivered before racing an interview to Racing TV, but it felt more like a statement. He repeated it to the press, in which he didn't want to talk about why this sabbatical had occurred, didn't reference those Royal Ascot rides that was so much in the news, but he wanted to stress his future. He did have a future, that he would ride for the rest of this year and that he would ride next year, and then who knows. He had a winner on his own ride for Lazoo, on Lazoo, trained by Rafe Beckett, and he was pretty emotional afterwards because he got the sort of warm reception that you'd expect Frankie Dettori to receive, and it clearly meant a lot to him. He stressed how he's off to Germany this weekend to run the German Derby. He's riding in America the following weekend for Charlie Appleby. He's actually riding out for Charlie Appleby on Saturday morning. So he's still getting big bookings. But I think now we do have to ask, what does this mean for the Gosdens and for Dettori? Frankie's bounced back so many times, but he wasn't 51 when that happened. And you can only have so long of a window to bounce back in. How strongly can he bounce back? And what's going to happen with those horses like Stradivarius, Inspiral and Emily Upjohn? You know, if the Gosdens aren't going to retain a jockey, and they say they're not, who'll ride Stradivarius at Goodwood? Probably not Frankie, given what Bjorn Nielsen was saying after the Gold Cup, but equally, Inspiral dotted up at Royal Ascot under Frankie. Will they really use somebody else on that filly when she runs in the Nassau Stakes? And could maybe someone like Holly Doyle benefit from this separation? She's ridden Nashua to victory in the Prix de Diane for the Gosden team, and I suggest in the column today that if one good thing is going to come out of this for the sport, yes, the sport's most famous face might not be riding all these great horses for the Gosdens, but if Holly Doyle starts riding a few of them, and I could see that happening, certainly with horses like Emily Upjohn, then that will be a fantastic outcome for her and maybe for the sport as well. It's a huge story, and Chris, you wrote about it in your front runner again today.
Yeah, so speculating about Frankie's future, really, which it's just a fascinating subject. Maybe the whole subject is fascinating, to be honest, because I realise some people are going, oh, the media have done this to death already. Yeah. But it's been like 3 days, man. And, you know, these guys were like, they were one of the most successful partnerships in the recent history of European horse racing. It's, you know, of course, it's a fascinating subject. If you can't keep talking about this subject for more than 3 days, then are you really interested in flat racing? It's so difficult for Frankie because the way that he operates, he's not a guy for everyday racing, isn't he? You know, he's just a bit richer, a bit more expensive than that. You know, he's I guess even if you could persuade him to go and ride one for you at Wolverhampton on a Monday, you know, could you be sure that you're going to get Livray Frankie? You know, probably not.
Do you think that's part of the reason why the split happened?
Well, but
Sadie now joining the team and they're wanting to look forward more.
They understood, I mean, I'm sure particularly John understood that that's what they were getting when they hired him. It was not that many years ago, and he was already really in that sort of space, wasn't he? And they didn't need him to ride the everyday horses because they have guys like Rab Havlin, who's very close to John, who's really, you know, great with the debriefing and giving insights into what kind of horse is going to be, educates a horse, brings him along, and when it's ready to be a Saturday horse, Frankie gets on it. So that worked really well. I don't think that can have been the issue. It's a puzzle to me, to be honest, to know what has gone wrong, because there was such a good understanding between trainer and jockey that I would have expected it would naturally be able to survive a few rocky rides. Now, okay, so this season has been nothing but rocky rides so far, really. They haven't had that many high points until you get to the Coronation Stakes, which I guess came too late in the day. I mean, by that stage, it seems they were dished. I would imagine we'll find out eventually. But you know, either way, it's a great pity that something's gone wrong. And it feels like there's limited options for a guy who wants to ride like Frankie does. I mean, Aidan O'Brien would have use for a jockey like that. Charlie Appleby would have use for a jockey like that. But you know, those guys don't have any vacancies just now. Yeah. And how many other jobs are there that would suit him?
I think this is fascinating, isn't it? I asked the Stradivarius question, if you like, on social media. I wonder if maybe Andrea Razzani is the one to step into the plate. He's ridden him to 2 Goodwood Cups already. You know, I'm not necessarily saying what I think is right and wrong. You know, they're entitled to jock Frankie off if they like on Stradivarius. But from a sportsman's perspective, I think for him to see a horse that he's created so many memories with, won so many big races, end his career under another jockey, whether he rides another horse in the race or not, that's going to be quite a challenge. And for me, the interesting thing about this story is Frankie was in a very comfortable position with the support of the Gosdens. You know, they're a huge yard, massive success, great backing. He's now said he wants to carry on. So what is that going to look like? Because before, it was almost up to him. He had so many good rides. If he wanted to bow out on the top, he could just pick from whichever Group 1 he won. Whereas now, if he's sort of struggling and mainly focusing internationally, does that mean his career is going to fizzle out a bit more rather than before, where it might have happened with a bang? Or will he keep these big rides from trainers like Rafe Beckett, who we might talk about Westover in a bit, and whether Frankie's going to ride him in the King George? But it was almost easy for him, I think, riding for the Gosdens, because it was a security blanket. He knew he had those horses there. And now he's faced with yet another challenge.
Yeah. Do you know what was interesting to me was he was riding in Istanbul on Sunday there, and I was just on social media searching for his name, his surname, just to try and get a feel for what was actually happening in Istanbul, because it wasn't sort of televised by any of our channels here. And there was this really big social media reaction, you know, in the Turkish language, just to the fact that he was taking part there and he hadn't ridden there for years. He's still he's a big name internationally, and you shouldn't underestimate that. I mean, it might be that trainers in this country are a little bit cautious. Well, we're already in the middle of the season. People have got their jockey arrangements all set. But I'm sure there are trainers all around the world who are perfectly willing to give him a try in a big race.
Well, he's just won the Dubai World Cup, hasn't he? So.
Absolutely right.
Well, that's it.
Wesley Ward seems to have, decided that maybe Irad is a better way to go. But I'm sure there'll be lots of other trainers offering him chances. And maybe we won't actually see that much of him in Britain for the rest of the year, because there are big bucks to be won elsewhere.
Potentially, and he did stress at Newmarket on Saturday, the fact that you won't see me much over the next few weeks is not an indicator that I'm finished. I'm just riding somewhere else. I thought the point that you made, Chris, about why has this happened was particularly interesting, because you said that John Gosden knows what Frankie's like, and that certainly is the case. we profiled him in the Post 3 years ago, going to reference that in the column, and I spoke to John Gosden for that profile, and his understanding of Frankie Dettori was exceptional. He spoke about him as someone who does experience highs and lows, but he also stressed that he likes to be part of the team. He enjoyed being part of that Clarehaven setup. He also made a comparison to that traditional Italian family setup. He liked being part of the group. So he will know how much this will impact him. He absolutely knew that this was a part-time arrangement, and I think it wasn't just a case of they were content with that. I think they wanted that. I think for the reasons that you suggested about Rab Havlin being such an important part of the team. They just as I don't imagine that Gordon Ramsay chops all the carrots, before he creates a great meal.
Does he not?
I don't think so. I think he comes in to do the finishing touches.
Why am I paying £200 for someone else to cut the carrots?
Night. So I think they knew what Frankie was and how he operates. Yet, the fact that he referenced that he was in Italy the week before Royal Ascot suggests I thought that was significant. It underlined what everybody has been saying, or that a lot of people have been saying, that this is a longer term thing. This doesn't just occur at Royal Ascot. Yes, Royal Ascot was a nightmare in many ways. Sometimes bad luck, sometimes bad judgment, it happens. But it clearly went wrong. And I think it's also probably important to stress that when this all started, this great renaissance that Frankie had with Clarehaven, there was one boss. Now there are two bosses. And the more people you have to please, and that's John and Thady. Big age difference between John and Thady. Thady hasn't been brought up with the whole Frankie story that John has. He might have different views. But whenever you have more people to please, as with an owner jockey who rides for an owner, you suddenly have more than one person to please, because that owner might have 7, 8 different trainers that he employs.
Yeah.
And it becomes a harder job. So I think there are loads of different reasons probably why it's happened. Neither side wants to talk about why it's happened so far. They both want to look to the future. But as you've both said, watching that future play out is going to be fascinating.
Definitely. I mean, would you back Frankie to bounce back and still have a career?
I think I would back him to bounce back. I think his enthusiasm seems to still be there from what he was saying on Saturday. My worry would be, the worry that you've expressed, how many avenues and places does he have to bounce back in? Yeah,
very few. I mean, my money's sort of on a big-time owner, a bit like what happened the last time when Al Shakab picked him up, and that worked so because they had Trev. It's not out of the question, is it, that Juddmonte would look at him for at least a few rides. I mean, he might be able to sort of step into a similar kind of role where he rides on the high days, but obviously, if that happens, then that's tough luck again on the other jockeys who are riding the horses in the interim. But I mean, it's a possibility, and I don't think they've had a sort of number one across Britain and Ireland for a good long while.
No, and that might potentially lead us into part 3, which will come after part 2. So, part 2 then. Chris, Frankie Dettori is 51 years old. There are some people who like racing who are considerably older.
Even older than Frankie, can you believe it? Yeah, so my story is about whether racing's doing enough to appeal to pensioners and people approaching pensionable age. The more senior group. It's not something that really occurred to me until this story appeared in our paper last week, written by our colleague David Carr.
Yeah.
But now that it has, I'm sort of kicking myself for not thinking about it because, frankly, like yourself, Lee, I've been around a few years, and it won't be long until I'm firmly in this bracket as well. What's happened here is a chap called Phil Evans, who's a long-term racing fan, and he's now chairman of the North and Midlands Racing Club. He's written in his newsletter and got quite a big reaction from his members about how concessions that used to be available for OAPs at the races have been sort of ebbing away since the pandemic. Other things have happened, like enclosures have been merged and websites have been rejigged so that concessions that were available are maybe hidden or not so attractive as they were. He feels strongly that, particularly when you get to midweek horse racing, pensioners are a sort of staple of racing's audience. Yeah. They're available to be there, and they always have been there whenever you go to racing. That's one sort of demographic that's always very well represented. He says this is a group of people who've been loyal with their support, who are available to watch racing as well from home during the week. And they never get any love. He says whenever you see marketing that racing puts out there, and this is so true. It was proved again last week, it's aimed at young people, isn't it? And I mean, I guess that's just, maybe it's just in the nature of marketers that they're always aiming that sort of 25 to 30 demographic. But I think in racing's case, you could probably call that, I think you must call that a mistake, because classically racing's appeal has not been to those younger folk. I mean, okay, so you can put on a good time, you can have, ladies' day at the races, and they'll always turn up for the big occasions like Royal Ascot and so on. But for the most part, racing seems to be a sport that people gravitate to as they get older. We could discuss at great length why that would be, but it certainly has seemed to be the case. And so it's got to be in the sport's interest to at least look after that demographic, those people. And I'm not sure really if there's ever been any kind of concerted effort from the centre to do that work. Phil makes suggestions like, for example, a midweek season ticket, that would make it more attractive for people to go, Wolverhampton or Redcar or whatever track happened to be in their area. It's not every track. He makes some honourable exceptions like York and Hexham and Pontefract, I think he mentions, that still make a conspicuous effort to look after older racecourses. But generally speaking, it's less attractive than it used to be. He mentions Jockey Club racecourses as not being good at offering concessions, and we did offer them the chance to say something in response to the story, and they haven't done so. Hopefully this is a story that's going to get people thinking. I do, as you know, a morning newsletter for the Racing Post called The Front Runner that goes out to subscribers. And since this story was out there, we've been getting quite a big pushback from people saying, yes, this is absolutely right, and thank you for raising this subject. It's been on my mind for so long. Racecourses are so thoughtless when it comes to older people. It's so hard to get a seat. If you go to, sports that compete with us, football, cricket, rugby, for your expensive ticket, you get a seat and you got somewhere to sit down. We're talking about people who have a hard time being on their feet for 3 consecutive hours. And so I think really there's been an element of neglect here for what ought to be a sort of core constituency for the sport, and something ought to be done.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. When I did a column a couple of months ago on the removal of cash as an option for spending money at a lot of racecourses, that had a lot of feedback, as with your with your front runner question about this. People did seem energised about it, and I spoke to people who couldn't understand why racecourses were saying to customers, you can't bring cash, you can't spend cash to get in, and you can't spend cash once you're in here, even though you're going to be spending cash in the betting ring. And one of the people I spoke to, very nice gentleman, a semi-retired solicitor, was making the point that he doesn't have a bank card, and he doesn't want to get a bank card. He uses cash. He goes to the bank cashier when he wants to draw money out. He gets money, and then he takes that money with him. And he felt, why is my custom no longer wanted on racecourses? We've had this debate in the past. Racecourses would tell you there are any number of reasons why they don't want people spending cash. A lot of them are commercial. But it does seem short-sighted to me. I do think that I can understand why this latest marketing campaign is geared more towards young people, and there's clearly there's a big audience there of people who don't go racing that this research suggests might go racing. So I can see why they're doing that. But equally, I was encouraged that Rod Street said in the Racing Post that he does think there is a real avenue to chase the older audience, and that we should be pursuing these people because they have got money to spend in racing that they're not spending. I think just in a wider sense with this debate, I always think that a key thing too is that the sport has to work hard not just on persuading people to go for a day at the races. It has to work hard on persuading people to become fans of horse racing.
Yeah,
sure. Great
thing about horse racing is it's one of those few things where you can go along if you're not really interested. You wouldn't pay 50 quid to see a play if you're going to spend most of that time daydreaming. You go because you want to watch the play. If you go to spend money on a rugby match, you're probably going to want to watch the rugby. Loads of people go racing. They're no interest in racing. They're going for a day out. It's a great thing for racecourses and for racing in a lot of ways. But equally, we need to convert people who go racing to become fans of racing. And that, I think, is somewhere where we're not being as nearly as successful as we could or should be.
Yeah, I totally agree, and this actually links back to a column I wrote a couple of weeks ago about how we market racing. And, you know, I'm going to get this out there. I'm not saying that if you're a social fan or if you do just like going for ladies' days or the day out, that's great. You should be appreciated as a customer who wants to do that. Absolutely. But at the same time, I am, and, you know, whilst acknowledging that GBR have a limited budget and we don't have sort of an overriding marketing arm in our sport, so it's everyone's responsibility, I guess, to promote the sport. I am a little bit nervous about how easy it is for racing to sell our sport as a good day out and as a good day out only. And I think if you look at that older generation, a lot of those people have sort of deep emotional connections with the sport. And I don't think we should lose that. I think that's really key. And I think as well as encouraging people to go racing, we need to encourage them to go for the racing. And not be afraid to sell our sport for what it is rather than the social day out, because that could be potentially quite damaging in the long term, I think. So I agree with you, Chris, but I do think you're not going to put OAPs at the centre of any marketing campaign, and I can understand why. You know, we definitely do need to do more for them, 100%, but in terms of looking forward, I think those things can be done without necessarily putting these people at the front and centre of how it's advertised.
It comes back to a familiar debate, really. Should racing be sort of thinking more about pleasing its existing customers or going chasing new ones? You know, and
it's a balance to be had, isn't it?
You've got to balance the whole risk against reward thing. And I mean, the reality is it's always been hard to attract young people or to get them to commit to the sport. It might be that this is a more productive way to go. At any rate, look, I accept marketing towards young people, it just has to be done. But this is work that also has to be done. And it doesn't feel like we've ever really done it.
But it's for everyone as well. A lot of these issues, you know, you're talking about seating or good access to facilities. They don't just impact people of the older generation. They impact everyone. And I'd argue we're all entitled to a better experience.
Yeah, definitely a better experience. The seat thing is interesting because I have the impression that, you know, so the money people who are behind race courses, they don't want you to sit down, because when you're sitting down, you're not spending money. You know, you need to be circulating and buying food.
I love to sit down at the races. I like to sit down.
So you're costing the race courses money with your inaction.
I'm just lazy.
I've got two friends who are older than me and would have a bus passage. And they made the point to me last year. They attended 2 days at Sandown on a Saturday, Sunday. The Sunday was one of the new Sky Bet Sunday Series days. I think the Saturday was Solario Day, and they enjoyed the Sunday much more because it wasn't as busy, and they did have a base for the day. They found a place they could sit down, and that was their spot for the day. They didn't have to pay for hospitality, but they did find a seat which could be their base, and I think that is important. I think as well, we just need to be more, racecourses need to be more creative in thinking how do we sell a day, how do we ticket a day at the race. And that point that you made about a midweek ticket seems to me to make really good sense. And it is the case that as we get older, there's a strong likelihood that we won't have as much money to spend. I'm already thinking now, you know, what am I going to, when I reach that age, how much disposable income am I going to have?
Lots of money, you know, there's no one's worried about your situation, but
well, you say that cats are expensive.
But I mean, I think there is, and that's the other difficult thing about this. It requires collaboration between race courses that may not be in the same group. You know, if you're aiming at sort of particularly the midweek thing, but I'm sure that can be done. I'm sure it's in everybody's interest to sort of to begin thinking about this important subject.
Maddy, the Irish Derby, Westover, Rob Hornby, and more.
Yeah, lots of talking points. They sort of all bleed into what we've been talking about, Dettori and, you know, racecourse attendances, that sort of thing. Two parts, this. One is sort of saying what a great race it was. I thought Westover was a brilliant winner. It's great for the race that he was the longest distance winner in something like 15 years. Very impressive and great to see a horse of his calibre win, but also that Rob Hornby was dropped off. Now, I know, Chris, this is something that you want to talk about. We've seen it throughout this season, jockeys being changed and chopped around, with Frankie Dettori himself, of course, in the Derby when he got the leg up on Pisford Deal. Will Dettori himself ride Westover in the King George? Because that's the way that I think connections are angling towards. It'd be great to see him be the Derby winner again. And then the overall health of the Irish Derby. There's been some grievances about entry fees. and also about attendances. 11,300 were in attendance on Saturday at the Curragh, which doesn't seem terribly high. So does the Irish Derby need to be doing more? I think so. And also, if you look at the quality of the race in general, you know, before the last 2 years, which interestingly have both been won by British horses, British trained horses in Hurricane Lane and Westover, we had a sort of gluttony of unsexy Irish Derby winners. Now, of course, that's natural, that's part of the cause. Not every year is there going to be a great winner. But with the Irish Derby's place in the calendar and the evolving trends in the sort of racing world, perhaps we're seeing a race that is just going out of fashion a little bit. Alan Sweetman wrote in the Racing Post not so long ago about proposing to drop the Irish Derby back to 10 furlongs. I'm against this idea, and we seem to talk about it every week on this show, but I kind of think it's emblematic of a wider issue in racing. You know, we should be incentivising owners, trainers to breed, to produce and to enjoy middle distance horses. You know, let's stop sending Crystal Oceans to become national hunt sires. Let's try not to get rid of all our decent 1.5 mile horses and ship them off to other countries. Let's get our prize money up and let's keep that level of racing as good as it can be. So I'd definitely be against the 10 furlong debate, but I do think this year's Irish Derby is very good. So sort of two strands to this story. But Chris, I'll go to you first. Westover and Hornby. To me, this happens a lot. And as much as it's sad for Rob Hornby, it's sad for whichever jockey it happens to. What do we think this means going forward? Why are you so keen to talk about it?
Well, there's a bit of one hand this, one hand the other, because, you know, anyone could be delighted for Colin Keenan. He was obviously you know, really pleased with that.
I think any of us could have rode Westover to win, though, couldn't we?
You know, it's so tempting to think that, but I bet in reality, you know, it would be very easy to muck it up.
Yeah, I'm tongue in cheek.
I'm sure, you know, Rob would have done a perfectly good job on it. I do feel sorry for him, and the argument always is from the connections on these occasions, you know, well, we want somebody who's established at this level. But how are you going to get established at that level unless you get chances? So yeah, I feel a bit sorry for Rob. But then there's another example very recently at hand, Richard Kingscott, who lost the ride on Brown Panther right before the St Ledger with Connection, saying exactly the same thing. You know, you don't get many shots at a classic win. We wanted to go for someone more established. Years later, you know, he happens on his Derby winner. So, you know, hopefully that kind of happy ending, as it were, is waiting there for Rob in the years to come. I haven't had that feeling about the Irish Derby myself. You know, maybe it's a subjective thing. I've always loved the race, and the advantage that it has is that it can be there as a sort of a decider. You know, if you happen to get, you know, horses that have won elsewhere in Europe early in the season. I mean, the classic example is going back a bit now. It's when Generous and Suave Dancer took each other on. I mean, that doesn't happen so much these days. You know, Epsom and Sean T form colliding at the Curragh. You know, I suppose particularly because the French Derby's changed its distance.
Well, that's right. I think the Irish Derby has been a victim of circumstance as much as anything else, in two ways really. One, in that the hegemony of Aidan O'Brien in European racing has meant that often the Irish Derby has been a procession for one of his horses. Which is great for Coolmore, and they have been.
I don't know about often.
Well, occasionally,
sometimes, yeah,
or other horses as well. But I think obviously sport is at its best when there's real competition, and if people think that's going to be a processional march, we're going to be that interested. But also, you referenced the French situation. I think that has been a big factor. Not just the dropping distance of the French Derby, but the rise in prominence of the Grand Prix de Paris as a 1.5 mile Group 1 race for 3-year-olds in mid-July. I think that has meant that those French horses now, they don't want to come to the Curragh because they've got the Irish Derby as an option. And I think as well, races do go in and out of fashion. I think sometimes for no obvious reason, a race just dips in the consciousness of racing professionals and they become less inclined to use it.
Do you know what? A lot of it has to do with connections as well, because, I mean, if it so happens that Aidan O'Brien trains the Epsom Derby winner, well, then you can be sure it's going to turn up in the Irish Derby.
And they are very keen to support the Irish Derby.
But, you know, that in itself is not necessarily good news for the Irish Derby as a contest, because, you know, you've got the Epsom Derby winner there, trained by Aidan O'Brien, and I've heard English trainers saying, you know, whenever you go over there, you feel like you're going into the lion's mouth. So that can just scare away the opposition by itself. You can sometimes get a really good contest in the Irish Derby when there hasn't been an emphatic Epsom winner, or he doesn't show up at all, and you've got other horses sort of fighting for the prestige. There's just a limited pool, isn't there, in terms of the number of people who own the type of horse that's going to turn up there, or train the type of horse that's going to turn up there. So yes, you'll get some fallow years, but I still love the race, and I think it'd be a great mistake to sort of try and tinker with the conditions.
It's worth saying as well, last two Irish Derby winners have placed at Epsom and then gone on to win the Irish Derby, which is great. I think we've seen some maybe drab years, but we've definitely had the last two have been very, very classy horses win it as well. Lee, I want to talk to you about the Curragh now, if I can, and 11,300 people on Irish Derby Day. What does this mean? Why is that happening, and what more can the Curragh do? Because I've never been, but there seems to be quite a lot of negative attention around the developments of the Curragh and how things have gone.
It's a racecourse that's had a troubled recent past. That's been very well documented. And I think they've got a chance now to rebuild with Brian Kavanagh coming in as chief executive. He's someone who's hugely respected. He knows the sport inside out. He was saying the right things, I think, after the Irish Derby. He was pointing out that the new grandstand, which had all these issues, whistling and all sorts of cues, that worked well on Saturday, but he hasn't got the same capacity as some grandstands would have, and therefore they're not maybe chasing the 25,000 crowds that they might have had in the past. Equally, I don't think there's any doubt that 11,000 people doesn't seem like a lot for a race like the Irish Derby, albeit it's the same sort of number they often get for the 1,000 guineas at Newmarket. I think it's reflective of the fact that flat racing in Ireland isn't as popular as you think it would be, given that Aidan O'Brien is the world's most successful flat racing trainer. They have got a problem marketing flat racing in Ireland.
I think so.
But I think it's probably good for the Curragh that Brian Kavanagh's come in there. I would have faith in him to do the best job that can be done with the Curragh in the current circumstances. And just going back to the jockey point which we started the discussion on, I thought that you referenced the Lion's Den aspect is why some connections might think, do we want to go and take on all the Aidan O'Brien trained horses? It was interesting that the decision re Rob Hornby was taken just a few hours before Aidan O'Brien actually announced he was only around one horse in the race this year. So as it turned out,
crossed my mind.
Particularly unfortunate for Rob Hornby, because as it was a race in which it would have been very straightforward to ride Westover. I do think with Rob Hornby, if there is a textbook way to handle a situation like this, he has handled it in that textbook way. He has been exemplary in reacting to what must have been a hugely disappointing decision.
And Colin Keane too, because he accredited him in the report.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's definitely good cause for Rob Hornby to be positive about the future. The fact is he was picked to ride Westover in the Derby. They didn't have any qualms about him there. You referenced the Richard Kingscote factor, the story with Brown Panther. 3 years ago, Tom Marquand was replaced in the Derby by Frankie Dettori on English King. Now, 3 years later, you wouldn't conceive of Tom Marquand being replaced by anybody in any race. He now is one of the absolute elite riders. And if you looked at this year's Derby, you had Richard Kingscote beating David Probert, beating Rob Hornby into third. That was a great result for the Derby. Three jockeys who wouldn't normally be associated with that sort of success, filling the first three places in the Derby. So I think for Rob Hornby, it will have been a really disappointing day on Saturday. I would hope he'd get back on the horse. No guarantee he will. Frankie will be available for the King George in all probability. Colin Keane will be available. They might go with one of them. But even if it turns out that Westover isn't Rob Hornby's ride in the future, I'd still be very confident that there'll be lots more good rides for him going forward. Okay, 3 stories discussed. That was the racing week just gone, and it is my job to determine what the front page story from this edition and for this week should be. And I'm sorry, you both presented excellent stories, but realistically, Frankie Dettori is Frankie Dettori. And in a week like he's had, he has to be the front page story. Do you forgive me?
I think we need a steward's inquiry, frankly.
Yes, I'm shocked and stunned.
From a shocked and stunned Chris Cook and Maddy Playle and myself, Lee Mottershead, that was the front page for this week. Tom Kerr is in the chair next week. Join him and the team, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.